Hey, hello friends, and welcome to the Chabura. For those who are here for the first time, welcome. We are an online Bet Midrash comprised of international students offering cutting-edge Torah for you to learn anytime, anywhere. Just a note to say that if you're watching or hearing this public shoot on YouTube or podcast, know that the Chabura has a members component to it. This includes a whole range of exclusive classes for our members that are not publicly available. Aside for the unique curriculum of classes in video and podcast form, our members receive a free book shipped to them each year, have the opportunity to write for our journals and books, attend live events, and to connect with hundreds of like-minded individuals from over 20 countries. In order to access all of this, you can become a member at thechabura.com/join, and I'll put a link to that in the chat box. We don't make a profit from any of our projects, so we appreciate the support of our members in ensuring the Chabura continues to provide cutting-edge Torah to a global audience. So if you enjoy what we're doing at the Chabura, please consider becoming a member today in time for our new curriculum beginning in September. Visit our website to find out more. And moving on to tonight we have the privilege of having a conversation between our Rosh Bet Midrash Senior Rabbi Joseph Dweck and Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs, Director of Atid and Web Yeshiva and the editor of the journal Tradition. In this exciting conversation, they will explore the extremes of Judaism and how rabbinic leaders address them. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you so much, Rabbi Dweck and Rabbi Sachs.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Ohad, for that wonderful introduction. It is a tremendous honor to be able to have this conversation with Rabbi Sachs. I am just concerned that Rabbi Sachs's camera or video is having some difficulty.
I'm here. Perhaps let me log out and go back in. I'm sorry.
Okay, let's try that. Let's try that.
Yeah.
All right, so but now we just make sure you're on mute, mute. There we are.
Apologies, I'm joining from my telephone. There must be something wrong with my computer, but I hope that this will be all right.
I hope that's all right for you. Sorry for the difficulties. All right, well, we'll kick it off. Baruch haba, Rabbi Sachs. It's an honor to be able to have you with us on the Chabura.
It's always nice to see you again, Rabbi Dweck.
Thank you. Likewise. So this is, the discussions that I've been having over the last few weeks have been essentially set by our guest, and you wanted to speak about extremes in Judaism. So I was wondering if you could perhaps orient us a bit to kind of where it is that you might want to open the discussion together.
Well, you and I have had a few conversations over the last number of years, so I thought this would be picking up on some things that we've been talking about, things that we've both written about, particularly in tradition.
Mm-hmm.
A few years ago, we ran a large symposium in tradition about Professor Chaim Soloveitchik's essay, Rupture and Reconstruction, which was then marking its 25th anniversary of its original publication. And we ran very many essays re-exploring what he had written. And you taught me an important lesson about not being Ashkenormative, as they say, because it was natural that given Professor Soloveitchik's own scholarly interests and the community he was describing in Rupture and Reconstruction when it was originally published back in the early mid-90s, that it was focusing on Ashkenazic Jewry in North America earlier in the 20th century. You correctly observed, and I was glad that you jumped into the fray, that the very many issues which have become so definitive for how we think about orthodoxy today through that prism of the mimetic tradition and the text tradition and Rupture and Reconstruction played out very differently in the larger Sephardic world. And even within the Sephardic world, it had played out differently from what you termed the Eastern Sephardim and the Western Sephardim. And since you yourself, your own biography intersects with both of these communities, both personally and now professionally, you offered a piece to that symposium, which was a necessary corrective to that. And among the things that you described, in which I think you and I, in a separate podcast that we ran on the Tradition website, had to do with these questions of how communities maintain a kind of moderation as a hallmark, and how there have been other trends within the larger Jewish world, the larger Orthodox world, both amongst Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, which have led to tipping away from moderation. And then last summer, in a special issue of Tradition that came out in book length, we explored the thought of Rabbi Norman Lamb, who had passed away the year before, and had, of course, been a very, very significant figure in the world of American Orthodoxy and of modern Orthodoxy in general, and had indeed been the founder of Tradition itself in 1958, the seat that I somehow, Hakatan, now occupy. And my contribution to that volume was an essay titled "The Extremes Are More Consistent but Absurd," which explored his own writings on modern Orthodoxy, on centrist Orthodoxy, and on moderationism as the kind of hallmark for what the community ought to be. So I thought that together, these common interests would make for an interesting conversation between us.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, I was very grateful to be asked to contribute to the Tradition journal that came out, and it actually brought out. I mean, when I actually had to sit down and write it out, it helps. Always writing always kind of helps crystallize ideas that are otherwise, floating in the mind. So I appreciate the opportunity for that. And yes, we've been speaking about these things in various iterations. And I enjoyed very much reading the article that you wrote about Rabbi Lamb and his in which you essentially outlined over the course of his career, right? So even before he became president of YU, when he was a younger rabbi, and his well, I'm going to use the word struggle, and you can correct me if you think that that's too much of a word, or that it's not necessarily accurate. But reading your words, I kind of felt that Rabbi Lamb had a struggle that ran throughout the majority of his rabbinic career in needing to kind of navigate, define. I recognize that you even highlighted there that at a particular point, he kind of moved away from the term modern Orthodoxy, went to centrist Orthodoxy, then went back to modern Orthodoxy, never was happy with the term modern Orthodoxy. But essentially, there was this struggle, there was this constant tension and need to be able to reiterate, establish, re-examine, and reassert, what was meant by modern Orthodoxy, what was needed, from modern Orthodoxy in the Jewish world among its adherents and those people who are questioning. So, reading through, I found that there was a great deal of tension, struggle around that. How do you, what are your thoughts on that?
So that's correct. In other words, the Rabbi Lamb was always much more at home, talking about the content of ideas, rather than niggling around the sides and debating matters of semantics, which are so often just distractions from substance, but sometimes take up all the air in the room, all the oxygen in terms of communal discussion. So at a certain point, he grew frustrated with the moniker modern Orthodoxy. In the essay, I mentioned, drawing on the research of some other people, how the community kind of came to adopt this name, modern Orthodox. The nature of things is often that communities don't always have the luxury of choosing their own names. Very often, those are names that are assigned to them from the outside, very often by their opponents. The most famous example might be the mitnagdim or the misnagdim. The opponents of Hasidut is a term which the Hasidim themselves give to their interlocutors, their opponents. And at a certain point in the early mid-'80s, he came to think that modern Orthodoxy had kind of taken on a kind of pejorative sense, that it meant a community that was not so strictly observant or not so careful about its religious commitments, a community that put modernity and engagement with secular culture first before before its religious duties, a kind of orthodox light. And he thought that, like a rebranding would help sharpen what the core values of the community were. So he chose the term centrist orthodoxy, but not centrism as a kind of, he says in one essay, not a kind of pariv form of frumkeit, or a kind of ideal, what he says, an ideological wimpishness. This kind of idea of centrism, but centrism, and here he hearkens to Rambam and to Rambam's vision of the golden mean, and that idea of constantly trying to measure and judge and weigh one's character, here the character of a community, to always stay on a middle path, which is not a mathematical average. Right. He says very carefully. Yeah, it's not some kind of mathematical average between, let's say, Reform Judaism and Satmar Hasidim, but a kind of moderationism, centrism in that sense of moderationism. But of course, this was not a very inspired choice, and like people in marketing will tell you that you can't assume that the consumers are necessarily holding in the finer details of the Rambam's Hilchot Deot or Shmona Prakim, and it was misunderstood. What he was trying to do was misunderstood. So he very reluctantly later kind of gave up and moved back to the term modern orthodoxy, but at the same time saying that this is all just spiritually distracting. And it was around this time that he began talking. This was exactly the time that I entered Yeshiva University as an undergraduate. And I mentioned this in the introduction to the collection of essays in memory of Rabbi Lamb, that this was exactly the time that he began discussing Torah Umada, which had always been a kind of empty slogan on the logo of Yeshiva University. And no one had ever really discussed it. No one had ever really talked about it at great length. But he points to
he
it.
Really unpacked it, really.
Well, he kind of pointed to this slogan, the interaction of Torah and worldly wisdom,
right,
as a way to help, let's say, organize communal identity and communal values, and what particularly Yeshiva University was doing, but Yeshiva University as the kind of flagship of modern orthodoxy
movement
worldwide. And this was more or less right around the time that Rabbi Soloveitchik made his exit from the public stage. In the last decade or so of his life, Rabbi Soloveitchik had taken ill and had gone into seclusion, not just into retirement, leaving this colossal vacuum, within the community. And Rabbi Lamb begins this discussion about Torah Umada, which turned to be a much more fruitful conversation than these silly semantic debates over what we should call ourselves.
Right.
Because it allowed him to, instead of dealing with semantic arguments, to deal with substantive arguments. And his book by that name, Torah Umada, which has now, I think, been issued in a couple of different editions. Most recently from Magid, from Koren publishers, with an afterword by your late and lamented senior rabbinic colleague in Great Britain, of course, Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, who, by the way, contributed a version of that essay to the Rabbi Lamb Memorial Volume shortly before his own untimely passing. So that book, Torah Umada, offers a kind of smorgasbord, a kind of menu of options of how the interaction between Judaism and worldly wisdom, secular culture, the big wide world, how it has classically played itself out, different models of Torah Umada, throughout Jewish history, and the book was not understood in all quarters.
Mhm.
It was kind of thought that he was offering some kind of, I don't know, Chinese menu. Choose something from this variety and that variety and the other variety. When instead he was putting forth portraitures of different models for how Judaism has played this out. And those models, he tried to figure what their meaning was for us.
Right.
So looking historically at the Kabbalistic model, the classic Hasidic model, the model of Rav Kook. Interestingly, he does not discuss Rabbi Soloveitchik in this work.
Did he see that as simply kind of like the continuation of the approach, and so therefore kind of speaking from that platform? Or
well, that's a separate conversation about where Rabbi Soloveitchik plays into
Rabbi Lamb's
thought, and we can maybe save that for a few moments from now if we come back to it. But what he was doing, he was saying that here are all the different ways that Judaism has historically engaged with worldly culture, right. and make no mistake, this is not some kind of compromise. Mm-hmm. In other words, our first commitments are to Torah and mitzvot, but our commitments to Torah and mitzvot never meant that we should view wisdom, broadly defined, as something polluted or something impure. Right? We always found a way through that kind of moderationism to incorporate it, and he kind of sound a warning bell to certain trends that were happening. This was 35 years ago, but he sounded certain warning bells about certain trends that were happening in the larger Orthodox community that I think we have seen come to pass in our own day.
Thank you. I mean, there are two things that I want to highlight and perhaps unpack a little bit. Well, one, I'm deciding which order I want to do this in. I mean, I guess I'll say one thing. I'll suggest one thing, kind of on the end of something you said earlier, and on the end of the title of your essay, and that is that the golden mean of the Rambam or of Aristotle, but as the Rambam ends up putting it out, and this recognition of Rabbi Lamb that what we're talking about is the midot of a community, right? The midot of a people, and how it is we balance ourselves in terms of not veering into extremes. And you rightfully saying, that the extremes are, you always know what's going to happen when you're sitting at the extreme. So any issue that arises, you can 9 times out of 10 anticipate how an extreme mindset is going to respond. It's not questioning and constantly looking at how it is that we best respond to the current circumstance. But what that suggests is that it's to be able to live in the middle, for lack of a better term, requires a tremendous amount of active thought on a regular basis. And I think that, when situations are relatively straightforward, it's difficult as it is to do that. But when you have a world like the one that we're living in which not only is there constant change and development, I would go so far as to say that almost every societal institution that you and I were used to simply being there, when we were growing up, giving, a rough period of time, has been, for all intents and purposes, dismantled and restructured in very different ways, and some are not even done, right? I mean, gender is not even something that we can hang our hat on clearly anymore. We don't know, nothing out there is kind of how things were. So when you're in the middle and you are choosing to assess what it is that's happening and to measure it against something, which that I think goes to the second point of what I wanted to address with you, but you have to measure it against what it is, whatever it is that you're measuring against. This case, I would imagine, Torah, or how it is that, Jewish thought might might respond to such a situation, it becomes, if not fatiguing and confusing, it almost becomes impossible, some people will say. And they may say it consciously or unconsciously. And so the easy thing to, and that's why I think, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts on this, but we're not just looking at extremes happening in terms of Judaism. We are watching a world in which the extremes are more severe and set today than we've seen in a very long time. And I don't
in nowhere more than the political debates, which
the politics, social groups. I mean, we've got gravitations to the extremes simply because we are in a world that is so difficult to manage in a kind of responsive, pragmatic way. So I wonder what your thoughts are on just the human psychological phenomenon that humans are digging their heels into what they know rather than.
Well, I find this very troubling, and it's interesting. You're in London, and I'm here in Israel. Two countries that are going through, let's say, interesting political moments.
Sure.
But of course, our attention.
There was somebody who has dual citizenship, Israeli and British, and he said, "I'd have no prime minister."
And so, in other words, but both of us, of course, are native of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, unimaginable what is happening in the political discourse in the United States. And I say this, with it doesn't matter.
No, it's not a political statement.
Right or
this
left.
is an observational reality. Yeah.
And this actually brings me to something that I just wrote in the most recent issue of Tradition, which is available online at traditiononline.org. It wasn't planned this way, but we excuse me. We published a cluster of essays that deal with questions of Jewish universalism and particularism.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of those kinds of evergreen topics that that modern Orthodoxy, kind of wrestles with. And I began by pointing to an essay that Rabbi Soloveitchik had published in Tradition in the 70s, an essay called Majesty and Humility, which in many ways revisits ideas that he had written about a decade earlier in the better known essay, The Lonely Man of Faith. But there, Rabbi Soloveitchik says the following: man was created of cosmic dust. God gathered the dust of which man was fashioned from all parts of the earth. Indeed, from all the uncharted lanes of creation. Man belongs everywhere. He is no stranger to any part of the universe. In short, man is a cosmic being. But then at the same time, Rabbi Soloveitchik goes on in a kind of dialectical fashion to offer the exact opposite point of view. And he says, man was created from the dust of a single spot. Here he's playing off a particular midrashic idea, the earth from which Adam, the Adamah from which Adam was created. Where did that earth come from? So according to one midrashic position, it was specks of dirt from all over the universe, and that gives man his cosmic, cosmopolitan, universalistic. But on the other hand, the midrash says man was created from the dust of a single spot. Man is committed to one locus. The Creator assigned him a single spot he calls home. Man is not cosmic. He is here-minded. He is a rooted being, not cosmopolitan, but provincial, a villager who belongs to the soil that fed him as a child into the little world into which he was born. So I titled my essay, It Takes a Cosmic Village. And this idea, this tension between being at home in the world, but yet somehow cloistered into our own little Dalet Amot, our own Altaheim, our own little world. This is the tension of the Jew. But I then kind of raise certain questions about things that are going on in the Orthodox world, particularly in the United States, that there's some kind of irony that as Orthodoxy moves more and more to the right, as Orthodoxy becomes more and more closed off to certain things in general culture, there's a great irony that the one cultural item that we remain most open to is the culture wars. And I was very disturbed on a recent visit to America because of COVID. Although I'm living in Israel now almost 30 years, I've spent almost my whole professional life here in Israel. But nevertheless, I return frequently to America, both for work and for family. And, I consider myself, as I'm sure you do, as I'm sure all expats do, still very much plugged into American life and culture, and certainly American Judaism. But this was the longest period I'd been away because nobody was traveling. And what a time to be away. And not just because of COVID, but because of, the political trends. And I was very disturbed to see the degree to which those culture wars have really caused fractures and fissures within mainstream modern Orthodox communities. In every community that I visited, there was at least one person, and in some cases a great deal more, who said to me, "Oh, you see that person? I won't talk to him. He's this kind of person, or he voted for that kind of person, or he thinks the following thing." And it could have, it's kind of like a Mad Libs, fill in a candidate and an ideology and a political party. And it could have flown, from left to right or from right to left. And I found this horrifying.
It's horrifying, but to me, I look at that and it is, it's part of the human condition. Why would the Jews be immune to these circumstances without a robust? I think this brings me to what I wanted to. I think for me, this is the main thing that I want to discuss with you, because after reading your essay and after reading, how it is you presented Rabbi Lamb's kind of, assertions of modern Orthodoxy and how he felt and what he wanted to do with it and so on. I can't help but say that for me as a Sephardic Jew, right, it was somewhat foreign to me. It was somewhat foreign to me, and I think I was able to kind of somewhat
which aspect?
I'll explain what aspect. I'll explain what aspect, because I think I was able to kind of delineate it in some sense, for myself. And I don't think that it's anything new, but I think that it's something that warrants discussion. So what I regularly saw, and I've seen this in modern Orthodoxy in general, not only in your article, just reading your article, it was quite prominent, and it was like almost a refrain that came through, and that is that there is this dialogue around two worlds, right? In other words, how are we going to live in two worlds? Even with regards to the slogan, Torah umada, and that we have to be able to kind of like be in one and be in the other, and there's no contradiction between the two. We should be able to do both. And I think that was the most foreign part of it for me.
Well, this is actually, you write about this, I think, quite cogently in your contribution to the rupture and reconstruction. In other words, Sephardic Jewry didn't undergo the same.
So I think it's something else
to be reconstructed.
Right. So I think it's something a bit different than that, because in my article, I was talking a lot about Eastern Sephardic Jews, right, who were not exposed to the Enlightenment and therefore did not have to deal with, or did not find themselves needing to deal with, the Enlightenment in the way that, the Ashkenazic Jews did. What would have happened should they have been exposed? I don't know. Nobody knows. We don't know how that would have played out. So I'm not going to entertain that. My issue is a different one. For me, and this is something else about, again, my understanding of, what I would certainly call classical Sephardic Judaism, certainly Maimonidean Sephardic Judaism, which is what the Chabura kind of is here to kind of promote and to give space for and dialogue to. And that is that you don't really see, and I certainly didn't grow up with this, you don't see the Rambam talking about some equivalent even of Torah Umada. What you hear is the Rambam talks about Chochmah Zeh or Chochmah Zeh. But you very rarely, if at all, do you have, I'm kind of like racking my brains, not that I've been through the exhaustive Rambam in every place and form that he's written, but you rarely find the Rambam talking about this how do we live in two worlds issue. And for me, the Sfaradim never really thought in those terms. And yet at the same time, there was no issue with engaging in the world. And so if I were to define how it is that I understand, perhaps what I perceive as a difference of the approach, but I'm going to open it to you to say, well, maybe, I don't know, you may say, well, it's not really a difference, it's semantics, which we can discuss. And that is, it's not two worlds, right? The question for me is, what is the contextual framework that an individual is living in, right? And for the Sephardic Jews, that were Torah faithful Jews, the context was always Torah, right? So, and I think of the fact that even the most basic Sephardic Jew was more often than not taught Chamisha Chumshei Torah, Mikra, with Ta'amim and so on. I mean, there was something of a base framework that was part of Jewish life. And then there was a question of how do I understand the world in terms of my framework? But the framework was very firmly a Jewish Torah-oriented framework. Right. And that's how I always experienced the discussions in the Talmud. I mean, anybody who's been through the Talmud, even in a cursory way, recognizes that Chazal are very comfortable talking about every single subject under the sun, if it applies to the human condition or not. Right. So what I read when I was reading, and again, like I say, I've thought about this with regards to modern Orthodoxy for a long time. I regularly kind of hear these questions of how do we do both? And my question is, what is the overall framework? And are the Western ideas, are the chokhmot, the worldly wisdoms, are they being brought into that framework and therefore colored by and understood through that framework? And for that matter, enhancing the framework by the introduction of new ideals? Or, is it a Western framework that is essentially rooted in the world, and we're inserting Torah ideas into that framework, and so this kind of question and tension to me is not something that's familiar to me, and at the same time, I'm not sure that it's the same as what it is that I'm suggesting, or what it is that I'm more familiar with, and so I thought I would ask you about that and how. Well,
in terms of historically how it's played out in the Sephardic communities, and indeed, the particular challenges that Sephardic communities, face in navigating these things today, you are, of course, far better suited than I to speak to that. And, to a certain degree, you did in this essay of yours, which we keep referencing. But I think that within, let's say, larger trends in Orthodoxy, and here we, have to admit that there's been a certain blurring of the lines. And I think we would agree that there are very many positive things about the breakdown of these dichotomies between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim that affect, the larger Orthodox world, regardless of the Eidah that a person comes from.
Sure. Sure. I'm simply talking about it in terms of my experience.
I think that a lot of it has to do with a kind of mindset that we haven't broken out of. So earlier in the 20th century, the world was presented as being threatening, and the secular world was viewed as being threatening, and Orthodoxy was in a defensive posture.
Right, but even when you say Orthodoxy, right, there's a lot here, right, that are part of the story, right? Why was it threatening? What was Orthodoxy, right? In other words, at this time that you're talking.
Just simply define it.
These are important points because they're all part of the,
Yeah, so I think simply defined, if you look in the 1950s, the 1960s, when our parents, let's say, were young, Orthodoxy, let's say, defined as a community of people committed to serious Torah observance. Yeah. It was not at all clear that this was going to be a going concern. And when all of the social scientists predicted that in a generation or two in the United States, Orthodoxy would be a museum piece,
Right.
Perhaps there'd be a small community of observant Jews left in a pocket in Brooklyn or the Lower East Side of Manhattan. But Judaism, the congregations were falling apart. People were moving out to the suburbs. The conservative and reform movements were ascendant. Orthodox synagogues were tearing down the mechitzot left and right. And if you were a gambling man, that's where the safe money was. Yeah. And what happened? Through a variety of forces and a lot of siyata deshmaya and fearless leadership, the exact opposite happened. Institutional orthodoxy in your country, in my country, and in our native land of the United States has never been stronger. There has never been a time in Jewish history that there were as many children receiving Jewish education as today. There was never a time when throughout all the years of the Galut, certainly, when security for Jewish observance was as protected, right? In the workplace, I think that's all true. Right? Things that, the old idea that if a Jew didn't go to work on Saturday morning, he didn't have a job come Monday morning. And therefore, Frumer Yidden, people who were committed in their heart and soul to Torah observance,
went to work on Shabbat.
This was Rabbi Pinchas Teitz, Zichrono Livracha, the heroic, legendary leader of the Elizabeth, New Jersey community, which was next to where I grew up. I once heard him tell an unbelievable story. When he went to Elizabeth, he became the rabbi of Elizabeth because he married the daughter of the previous rabbi of Elizabeth. And along with the daughter, he inherited the rabbonos of Elizabeth, New Jersey. When he got there, I think in the 1930s, this was a time where out in the suburbs of New Jersey, there was no day school. They were holding on by the skin of their teeth. He said that there were Jews in town who Friday night would make kiddush on the challah, and Shabbat morning would make kiddush on schnapps, because they all went to work on Shabbos. They would all get on a trolley and go down to wherever it was that they worked in, whatever sweatshop they worked in. And they knew the halacha, that it's usher to drink the wine of a Machalel Shabbat. Right? Can you imagine? Yeah. Can you imagine Machalel Shabbat of that level? But that's the way it was. And today it's just it's a different world.
It's a completely different world.
So, but we haven't moved out of that defensive posture that the big wide world is quite so threatening. Yes, certainly there are things in the big wide world. There's certainly things in secular culture that are antithetical.
Well, there are toxins in everything. Like we say, we have to be concerned about toxins. But I think
just let me to finish my thought. You asked for a conceptual framework. I think that there's still part of that taboo and a certain sense of suspicion and the jaundiced eye that we look to the world with, but we're looking always in the wrong places. Because when it comes to absorbing the leisure culture of general society, that we have done kosher mahadri. Right. In other words, just look at the options for vacations.
Yes, of course, we've completely taken that on.
But people don't feel that that's somehow adopting
because they have control over it. Because they have control.
I think they have control. Right? There was the consumerism. There's this illusion that we have control.
Yeah, what you're describing, right, is that there is a fear at the base. And I think I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think there is a fear at the base. I think the fear at the base is what drives, halachic extremism on many levels, right? It's not just what are we going to do? How are we going to, are we going to lose the people, or is the religion going to fall apart? It's also, are we going to have to answer for it? in terms of ruling the law. And I think, this fear element, what you're describing is the fear of the big wide world. Again, I don't mean it, I don't want to bring it back to, intentionally to, ethnic issues, but I genuinely think that it's more prominent in Ashkenazi culture than in Sephardi culture.
Let me throw the question back to you then,
because
this is something that, of course, you're well seated and well suited to address, and you have in your writing and in your teaching, and you often, of course, particularly point to the example of Rav Avadia Yosef Zecher Tzadik Livracha as this kind of maintaining this posture against extremism in halacha as a way of being the most authentically halachically engaged. And that's something that the Sephardic community has done, I think, much more efficiently and much more bravely than the Ashkenazic community. But even there, we see trends. And so where do you see that going in, amongst Sephardi poskim? And
I think, in all honesty, I think it's a good question. And I again think that this has to do with the human condition, right? In the face of what the world that we are living in, the pull to extremes, and it's important to recognize the extremes are not only to the right? I mean, there are extremes that are moving far to the left. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people whose parents were middle of the road, what you and I would call Orthodox Jews, that are relinquishing connections that, again, in the same way I would, in the way that you're thinking, how did people work on Shabbat? Then I'm thinking, in many instances, how are the kids and grandkids of these people not holding what their parents and grandparents held and are allowing themselves to move very much to the left? So I think that what's happening is that the human animal, right, is in the face of a very rapid, very fast moving and changing world, digging their heels into what it is that they know and moving further and further to extremes. And I don't think that it's that different than what we're watching on the sociological and political sphere. And it is still important. I mean, I think in our discussion, it's important for us to be able to kind of like mark this here, because I know that this is something that you and I very firmly believe and agree on. I don't want to speak for you, but knowing you, I know this is true. It is still essential that the center holds. And that there is teaching and guidance and education around what it means to be able to manifest and to hold strong at the center. And that is something that we are struggling to be able to maintain today. And so
I think there's another
and I don't think that's different. I'll be clear. I don't think that's different between Sephardim and Ashkenazi.
No, I agree.
We were talking historically, and I was saying in terms of perspectives and fears and frameworks and so on. But I think here in the world today, where we are globalized for all intents and purposes, and there's huge cross-pollination, it's just what's going on with the Jewish people.
Right. No, I agree with you there. But there's another wrinkle here, and that is that part of all of this conversation, to take it back to Rabbi Lamb and Torah Umada, was that the engagement with the world, which we either embraced or looked at with caution, was a kind of engagement with culture, the kind of idea of the best that's been thought and said, the idea of the Western canon, liberal arts, that these were things that somehow had the potential. It doesn't happen automatically, but these are the types of things that have the potential to ennoble the human condition. Of course, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, wrote about this more eloquently, perhaps, than anyone else. But that today, altogether, the humanities and the liberal arts and liberal arts education are on the ropes. That people are not getting the kind of broad Western education that even just a number of years ago,
that's absolutely
generations ago.
I mean,
everything is, and education and culture has become extremely utilitarian focused, and that changes the whole conversation, because the question of Torah Umada, there has to be something of substance on the other side of the equation in order for there to be some kind of interaction. And if it's just business focused, And I do not begrudge anyone who feels the need to have a career in business. After all, Imein kemach ein Torah, but kemach
the
alone
question of
is
the
not enough.
humanities being used for these purposes.
And I think and that's true, but that's true in across Jewish communities and across worldwide communities, in terms of the degree to which people are no longer engaged with.
I think that's true, but I think that there's more here. There's more here, because we can say easily, it used to be that there was some substance in Western culture and thought, and today there isn't. I think that, I don't think that's what you're saying, but it's a large generalization. And the reality is that even from a Torah perspective, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is running the world. And there's going to be elements within that world that are important for us to be able to look and see what's happening in it, and what elements of it might we recognize within the framework of our of Torah thought, and Torah context. There's always going to be something, that is of value for us to be able to learn. I believe that anyway, and again, I question this kind of. It sounds like there's a dichotomy, right? It's either that world or our world. And perhaps, I was thinking about this earlier today. It's Chochmat Yavan Lechud and Tarbut Yavan Lechud. Yeah, there's always something to be seen in the Chochmah. Yeah, then which is different than the Tarbut, right? Which is different than the culture. There's always something to be seen in the wisdom or in the thought, even if it's something that we want to look at, think, and say, something, I don't agree with that, as opposed to the culture of the society that is occurring. But there has to be a measure, and that's what I think is important to be able to highlight here. And the measure for us has to be a framework of Torah, of sophisticated Torah thought, right? And how it is that we understand the details of our current world within that framework. So the problem is that one needs a framework, right? Or one at least needs leaders that have that framework and are using that framework. And I wonder whether modern Orthodoxy today, or where modern Orthodoxy is with regards to that question, if that makes sense, or is it simply just, it's getting too scary out there, and we can't, be in both worlds in the way that we once thought we could, and then the whole concept of modern Orthodoxy kind of is in question. I don't know if that's fair.
Despite if somebody would cut out of the conversation here, they would think we're both chicken littles, fearing that the sky is falling down on us. But I'm actually quite optimistic. I think that, first of all, I have a lot of optimism about Torah and Yahadut and our ability to somehow always pull through. It would be naive to think that there is such a thing as any one community which remains unchanging and unevolving. We wouldn't want such a thing.
No.
And modern Orthodoxy will emerge, in each generation, responsive to the challenges that face.
When you say that you're optimistic, where do you see modern Orthodoxy going in the next 5 years, 10 years? I don't know if that's a fair question, but let's say it perhaps. What are the trends that you see that you're kind of keeping an eye on? Where do you see that things are moving? Right. In terms of modern Orthodoxy?
I think that there's a lot of conversation that's happened. England naturally is always a smaller community, a smaller community that punches above its weight class, but a smaller community.
But when you talk about England
numbers, but I think that there is, and some people have written about this and observed it. There is a certain sense that there's something of a brain drain from American modern Orthodoxy towards Israel. That modern Orthodoxy, after all, has always been a kind of there's a certain kind of intellectual buy-in, which is part of the problem, by the way, because not every person is cut out to be a little religious philosopher. Yeah. Right. Not everybody is meant. This is a critique. We can take this back to the conversation in terms of the Maimonidean ideals.
Right.
Part of the challenge of the Maimonidean ideals is that it requires such a lofty buy-in on the part of the adherent, and not everybody's a little philosopher king. And that's a challenge. And there are many people just simply, couldn't participate in the vision of such a religious community because the world needs simple Jews as well. Thank God.
Yeah.
But there is a sense that a certain amount of the intellectual leadership of modern Orthodoxy has gravitated to Israel. But that's happened at a time when, we live in much more of a global village.
Yes.
And
right.
How
so it's not isolated there, right? It's not isolated there,
right?
But
that does mean certain things for who are the educators in our schools, who are the rabbis of our shuls, and I think that's something that we have to keep our eye on, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where our ability, you and I and others, to have these lofty conversations and think that it has some kind of meaning for the people that are listening to us. But ultimately, the impact is who's the person in the classroom with our children, and who's the person in the pulpit with our families. Absolutely. And ultimately that shapes the nature of a community far more than what gets published in a journal of Jewish thought or takes place in highfalutin conversations on Zoom in the evening. And I think that's the place to be looking. So I know that my friends back at Yeshiva University, the people who were my roommates and classmates, who are now responsible for running the institution, it's on very good footing. And of course, there's always a challenge, and there's always a crisis, and there's always great need. But if you kind of look, from a 20,000 feet, you realize that things are really institutionally, organizationally, communally. Again, like I said, they've never been this strong, which doesn't mean that it looks exactly the way that it looked in 1994 or in 1964, and that's okay. On the contrary, it's good that it doesn't. So I think that's that's one thing.
Well, I think that's a very important point.
Yeah. To take it back to the point of conversation where kind of religious ideology and political thought intersect. Of course, in Israel, it means something else entirely. Because here we have the great zchut of, a Jewish community managing its own autonomous affairs. And the degree to which religious Zionism, which is not exactly identical, it's not an ideologically identical movement to modern Orthodoxy, but there's enough overlap that we can talk about the two communities as being one. The degree to which religious Zionism has politically become so transformed is something I think to be concerned about. I know that Rabbi Yosef Blau, the great Rabbi Yosef Blau of Yeshiva University, just penned an op-ed that appeared in the Times of Israel this week, bemoaning these facts, that religious Zionism as a political movement here in Israel, the classically the Mafdal, the National Religious Party, which no longer exists. It was once a big tent party that drew in people across religious denominations, and was concerned about things like social welfare and education, not just religious education, but also religious education, and healthcare, and these important issues. And they said Torah and Judaism has something to say about these things, and this is the great gift that we have returned to be liot am chofshi be'artzenu, right? To be the masters of our own destiny in our own land, because now we can take the Torah values, right? The Torah values aren't just about what happens in the synagogue. It's what happens in the hospitals, and it's what happens on the unemployment line, and it's what happens, in the secular schools. And because religious Zionism gave up on that in order to focus almost exclusively on questions of land and greater Israel, that comes at a great cost. Even if you think that land and greater Israel is the most important value in the Torah, it still comes at a very great cost. So here it plays out in a different way and a potentially troubling way. But again, you never know how well, here, because we have elections so frequently, there's always a chance to get it right the next time. And if we don't get it right this time, we'll get it right 3 months down the road at the next elections.
Many millions of shekel later. Yes. But I think I do want to recognize what you said about the institutions and having the teachers in the classrooms and the rabbis at the pulpits and so on. And I think you're absolutely right that is where the rubber hits the road, and that is the most important thing. And you touched on England, and it's happening less so here. I think that is happening less so here, and it's something that is very important for us to.
What's happening less so?
I think that the community, the Jewish community in Britain, is predominantly. I mean, I'm talking about the Orthodox community. Is predominantly, again, using the word centrist, right? It's quite moderate, but the rabbinate is less so, right? The rabbinate is a bit less so, and that's it's part of the kind of the Jewish dynamic in the country, and so I think that there's room for I mean, we need to be able to train rabbis in the pragmatic, worldly approach to Torah, and we need to be able to train teachers in that as well. And it's something that certainly with the voice of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, alav shalom, there was very strong voice for it, and people kind of were able to connect to that. But with his passing, there's certainly a void there. And in general, in British society, there is that kind of difference between the leadership and the people. Not in every area, and certainly not in every institution, but it's definitely something that is part of Jewish Orthodox life here in the country. And so,
I think it's natural that like the rabbinic leadership should always somehow be a step beyond the community they lead. That's how we move the needle. But that question, also the kind of differential, the differential between if there was a kind of mathematical formula we could develop for where the rabbinic leadership is and where the community is, there's got to be a kind of delta that we can look at to say that at a certain point, if the leadership gets out too far removed from where the people are, that's to the detriment of everyone. If the leadership is exactly where the people are, that's also to everyone's detriment, because there's no sense of, man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's heaven for, as Browning said. That's the role of rabbinic leadership, to remind people that there is a purpose for heaven and that it's worth reaching for it and stretching. But there's a certain point where the horse has lost the cart. And, that plays out differently in England than in America, than in Israel. And within each place, communities play it out differently. And I think that's another thing to keep an eye on.
Absolutely agreed. It's certainly encouraging and a chizuk to hear that you are optimistic for how it is that things are moving forward. It's always important to hear. And looking at time, we've come to the end of our time, and I want to thank you again, Rabbi Sachs, for your
thank you, Rabbi Dweck, and thank you for the work that you do.
Wisdom, your erudite, articulate, way of expressing these very, very important thoughts. And thank you so much for supporting and being a chizuk to the Chabura, which hopefully is another kind of course within this space. And I always look forward to being able to do more together.
And I to you. I hope to see you soon. And I'll just remind the members of the Chabura to visit us at traditiononline.org, because it's important that people be reading and thinking and engaged with ideas and with scholarship and with philosophical writing and the ideas that are meant to inform and raise up, the community on the kind of engagement with thought that can help move these things along.
We've got the link to it in the chat, so everybody can pick up on it there. And yes, absolutely. Thank you, Rav. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you
Well,
so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Fascinating.
Thank you so much.